June 12th, 1899. It was supposed to be the happiest day in the history of New Richmond, Wisconsin. Just close your eyes for a second and imagine it. The smell of hot buttered popcorn, the sound of brass bands playing a march, the laughter of 3,000 people packed into a small town for the event of the year. The circus was in town. It was a day of bright colors, the red of the clown noses, the gold of the trombone, the blue of the summer sky. But 3 hours later, the colors changed. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple. Then it turned green, and then it turned black. By the time the sun went down on June 12th, the circus was gone. The town was gone. And 117 people were dead. This is not just a story about the weather. This isn't just a story about wind speeds or barometric pressure. This is the story of a cruel paradox. It is the story of how a celebration became a slaughter. How the very thing that brought everyone together, the joy of the circus, was the exact thing that trapped them. In 1899, they didn't have radar. They didn't have sirens. They didn't have iPhones to buzz with an emergency alert. They only had their eyes. And by the time they saw what was coming, by the time they realized the low rumble wasn't the circus train leaving the station, it was already too late to run. Welcome to the story of the New Richmond tornado. To understand how a tragedy of this scale happens, you have to understand the stage it was played upon. If you look at a map of Wisconsin today, New Richmond looks like any other quiet Midwestern town. It sits in St. Croix County, a grid of streets, homes, and history. But if you strip away the modern pavement, if you look at the land itself, you see the first fatal flaw. New Richmond sits in a valley, a bowl. The Willow River cuts through the landscape, carving out a depression in the earth. In the late 19th century, this river was the town's lifeline. It powered the mills. It brought in the timber. It was the reason the town existed. It was a booming hub, a lumber town, a farming center. Business was good. The population was around 2,000 people, solid, hard-working folks. They built their shops on Main Street out of brick and stone, thinking they were building for eternity. They built their homes on the east side, neat rows of wooden houses with white porches. They felt safe here. But that valley, that bowl, on a hot summer day, it cuts off the view of the horizon. If you were standing on Main Street in New Richmond, down in that bowl, you can't see the storms coming from the southwest until they are right on top of you. It creates a blind spot. And on June 12th, that blind spot would prove to be deadly. Keep your eye on the Willow River. This water source, usually the town's greatest asset, is about to become a trap. But before the clouds gathered, there was the excitement. If you could travel back in time to the morning of June 12th, you wouldn't sense any danger. You would only feel electricity. The Gollmar Brothers Circus had arrived. Now, you have to understand what this meant in 1899. There was no television, no internet, no movies. When the circus came to town, it was the Super Bowl, Christmas, and the 4th of July all rolled into one. The Gollmar brothers weren't just a small sideshow. They were the first cousins of the famous Ringling Brothers. They ran a massive operation. They brought the exotic to the mundane. They brought elephants to Wisconsin. They brought acrobats who could defy gravity. They brought a world of wonder to a town of lumberjacks and farmers. And because of this, New Richmond didn't just have its usual 2,000 residents that day. The trains had been unloading since dawn. People came from Hudson. They came from Stanton. They came from the tiny farming communities miles away. By noon, the population of New Richmond had swelled to over 3,000 people, strangers, tourists, families, children. The streets were packed, shoulder to shoulder. There is a tragic irony here. If the circus hadn't been in town, the farmers would have been on their farms, the tourists would have been in their own towns, and the streets of New Richmond would have been quiet by dinner time. But the circus acted like a magnet, or perhaps a Trojan horse. It drew everyone into the center of the bullseye, and it held them there. We are going to walk you through this day, minute by terrifying minute. We are going to show you exactly how the perfect storm came together. back to June 12th. It is noon. The parade is moving down Main Street. The brass band is blaring. The horses are stepping high. But there is something else present, something invisible, the heat. Every diary entry, every letter written by a survivor mentioned the heat. It wasn't just hot, it was oppressive. It was the kind of heat that sticks your shirt to your back the second you step outside. The air was thick, heavy, saturated with moisture. Farmers looked at the sky and nodded. They called it good corn weather. Corn loves heat and humidity. It thrives in it. But corn isn't the only thing that thrives in that kind of atmosphere. The air temperature was climbing into the 80s, pushing toward 90. But the dew point, the measure of moisture in the air, was incredibly high. It felt tropical. To the people watching the parade, wiping sweat from their foreheads with handkerchiefs, it was just an uncomfortable summer day. But to a meteorologist looking back, it was a loaded gun. That heavy as wet air was fuel, high-octane gasoline, just waiting for a spark. And while the clowns were painting their faces, and the children were begging for peanuts, something massive was brewing 20 miles to the southwest. A collision was happening in the atmosphere. Let's linger here for a moment, in the golden hour, the hours between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. This is the time of peak joy, the calm before the chaos. Among the crowd, we find the Glover family. They were wealthy, prominent. They had everything going for them. They had secured some of the best seats for the afternoon performance. Imagine the father checking his pocket watch. Imagine the mother adjusting her hat, laughing at something a neighbor said. They are surrounded by noise, by life. The circus tent was set up on the edge of town, a massive canvas cathedral dedicated to fun. At 3 p.m., the show began. Hundreds of people filed into the big top. Think about the sensory experience, the smell of sawdust, the smell of animals, the trapped heat inside the tent. It must have been stifling, but nobody left. Nobody wanted to miss the show. They watched the trapeze artists fly through the air, completely unaware that in a few hours, objects much heavier than people would be flying through the air with much greater violence. This is the sunk cost of the tragedy. These families had traveled for hours. They had spent their hard-earned money on tickets. They were committed to the day. Even if the sky started to look dark, even if the wind started to pick up, they weren't going to leave, not yet. They had paid for a show, and nature was about to give them one. While the applause was roaring inside the tent, the atmosphere outside was reaching a breaking point. Let's zoom out. Let's leave the sweating crowd for a moment and look at the physics of what was happening over Wisconsin. It was a classic setup for disaster, a perfect storm in every sense of the word. You had a layer of incredibly warm, moist air near the ground. That's the fuel. Above that, you had a layer of cold, dry air moving in from the west. Usually, warm air rises. It wants to go up. But on this day, there was something called a cap. Think of it like a lid on a boiling pot. The warm air wanted to rise, but the atmosphere was holding it down. Pressure was building, and building, and building. It was like a spring being compressed tighter and tighter. The energy was there, trapped. And then, around 4 p.m., the cap broke. The lid blew off the pot. The warm air shot upward at incredible speeds. It punched through the atmosphere, soaring 50,000 feet into the air in a matter of minutes. This is how a supercell is born. Survivor A.B. Smith later described the clouds that afternoon. He said, "It looked like a boiling pot of yeast." Imagine that. The sky, boiling. Clouds weren't just drifting, they were churning, tumbling over each other, exploding upward. The first warnings didn't come to New Richmond. They came to the farms southwest of town. Lake St. Croix. Out there, the sky began to darken rapidly, and then the hail started. This wasn't normal summer hail. This wasn't the size of peas. Reports say the hail that fell near the St. Croix River was the size of teacups. Some said the size of baseballs, chunks of ice, jagged and hard, smashing into roofs and destroying crops. This is a telltale sign of a monster storm. It means the updraft. The wind blowing up into the storm is so powerful it can keep a baseball-sized chunk of ice suspended in the air against gravity. But New Richmond, nestled in its valley, couldn't see the hail. They couldn't hear the thunder yet. The circus ended at 4:30 p.m. The timing here is critical. If the circus had run 30 minutes longer, everyone would have been inside the tent when the storm hit. If it had ended 30 minutes earlier, the tourists might have already been on their trains and halfway home. But it ended at 4:30. This dumped thousands of people out onto the streets right as the dinner hour approached. People didn't go home, they lingered. The restaurants were full, the saloons were packed. People stood on street corners, talking about the acrobats, talking about the elephants. The town was a bottleneck of humanity, and the sky began to change. It is now 5 p.m. Clouds are building in the southwest, dark, ominous. But remember, this is the Midwest. Summer thunderstorms happen all the time. People looked up and thought, looks like rain. They didn't panic. They opened umbrellas. They moved under the awnings of the shops on Main Street. There was a strange phenomenon happening with the clouds. They were scud clouds, low, ragged fragments of cloud moving quickly beneath the main storm base. To the untrained eye, they just look like bad weather. But to a storm chaser, scud clouds moving in different directions are a sign of rotation. The atmosphere over New Richmond was starting to spin, but down on the ground, amidst the laughter and the post-circus buzz, there was a sense of false security. It's just a thunderstorm. It will pass. Let's get some dinner and wait it out. This assumption was the final nail in the coffin. 5:30 p.m. The light is failing, but the sun hasn't set. The darkness is coming from above, and the color is wrong. Survivors would talk about this for the rest of their lives. The color of the sky. It wasn't gray. It was a sickly, metallic green, like the color of old copper, or a deep, bruised purple. This is caused by sunlight filtering through massive amounts of hail and water high in the storm cloud. The wind began to die down. This is the cruelest trick of a tornado, the calm. The air became still, dead still. The flags on the buildings stopped waving. The trees stopped rustling. It was as if the world was holding its breath. In that silence, you could hear the voices of people on the street clearly. You could hear the dogs barking nervously. And then, a sound began. At first, it was faint. A low rumble, like a train. New Richmond was a railroad town. They knew the sound of trains. People checked their watches. Is the 6 o'clock freight coming in early? But the sound didn't fade like a train passing. It got louder and deeper. It became a vibration that you could feel in your chest. A grinding, mechanical roar. Imagine standing there, holding your child's hand. You look at the train tracks, but there is no train. You look at the sky, and you see it. It formed near the St. Croix River, a massive, wide funnel. It didn't look like the skinny ropes you see in the movies. This was a wedge, a wall of cloud descending to the earth. It touched down on the farms outside of town. The first casualties were the trees, ancient oaks, snapped like toothpicks. Then, the farmhouses. We have records of the destruction out there. It was total. Barns didn't just collapse. They were atomized. The wood was turned into confetti. The tornado was moving northeast, directly toward the bowl, directly toward New Richmond. It was traveling at nearly 50 miles per hour. That is terrifyingly fast for a storm. Most tornadoes move at 20 or 30. This one was racing. It was covering nearly a mile every minute. Back in town, the panic began to set in. But it was a slow panic, a confused panic. People stood in the streets, pointing. Is that a cyclone? No, it can't be. We don't get cyclones here. It's just a heavy rain shaft. Denial is a powerful human instinct. We don't want to believe the monster is real until it is breathing in our faces. But then, the debris began to fall. Not hail, debris, leaves, twigs, shingles, pieces of insulation, falling from the sky like a grim snow. This is the debris that the tornado had sucked up miles away. and was now spitting out ahead of itself. When you see debris falling from the sky, the monster is already upon you. 6 o'clock. The church bells rang the hour. Gong, gong, gong. It would be the last time those bells would ever ring. On the southwest edge of town, a man looked up over the ridge of the valley. He saw the wall of black spinning earth cresting the hill. It was no longer just wind and cloud. It was a blender filled with trees, mud, and the wreckage of the farms it had already consumed. He screamed, "Cyclone! Run for your lives!" But where do you run? You are in a valley. The storm is as wide as the town itself, and the streets are packed with 3,000 people. The countdown had reached 0. The clock had stopped ticking. 6:05 p.m. The tornado hit the residential section on the southwest side first. It didn't knock on the door. It kicked the house down. We need to talk about the sheer violence of an F5 tornado. The Fujita scale wouldn't be invented for another 70 years. But modern meteorologists who have analyzed the damage of New Richmond agree. This was an F5, the top of the scale, the finger of God. Wind speeds over 200 miles per hour, maybe even 250. At that speed, wind doesn't act like air anymore. It acts like a solid object. It acts like a moving brick wall. It can debark trees, stripping the bark right off the wood. It can scour pavement off the ground. It can drive a piece of straw, a fragile piece of straw, straight through a wooden telephone pole. As the funnel moved into the residential streets, houses simply exploded. The pressure drop inside the tornado was so severe that the air inside the homes expanded instantly, pushing the walls outward. One moment, a family is sitting at the dinner table. The next moment, the walls are gone, the roof is gone, and they are being sucked into a vortex of screaming wind and debris. It moved toward the center of town with a horrifying intelligence. It seemed to follow the street grid. It was heading straight for Main Street, straight for the tourists. In the chaos, people had seconds to make a decision. Those decisions would determine if they lived or if they died. Some people ran for the Methodist Church. It was a large, sturdy brick building, a house of God. It felt safe. It felt permanent. Dozens of people crowded into the basement, mothers clutching their babies, men praying. Across the street was the Bank of New Richmond. It was also brick, but it had something else, a vault, a heavy, steel-reinforced walk-in vault. A group of men ran into the bank and squeezed into that vault. They pulled the heavy steel door shut, plunging themselves into darkness. 2 sturdy buildings, 2 groups of terrified people. But the tornado doesn't care about architecture, and it doesn't care about prayer. When the wind hit the Methodist Church, the brick walls didn't hold. The roof was lifted off, and the heavy brick walls collapsed inward. They collapsed right into the basement. The sanctuary became a tomb. But the bank vault, the bank building was torn apart. The bricks were stripped away. The offices were erased. But that steel vault, that tiny steel box, held firm. It was tossed around, buried in rubble, but it didn't crush. The men inside heard the roar of the apocalypse just inches from their ears. They felt the earth shake, but they lived. The decisions made in those split seconds, left or right, basement or vault, were the difference between life and death. And what about the circus? Remember the tent, that massive canvas structure on the edge of town? Logic would tell you it should have been the first thing to go. It was flimsy. It was held up by ropes and poles. Hundreds of people had fled the streets and run back toward the circus grounds, thinking the open field was safer than the collapsing buildings. The tornado roared past the circus grounds. It tore at the edges. It ripped up wagons. It threw animal cages like toys. But incredibly, the main tent stayed standing. The big top survived. But the people running toward it, they were caught in the open. They had no protection, no walls, no basement. The wind caught them. This is the part of the story that is hardest to tell, because the physics of a human body in 200-mile-per-hour winds are horrific. People were lifted off the ground, thrown hundreds of yards. The debris field wasn't just wood and brick. It was filled with the things that make up a life: cash registers, pianos, cook stoves, and People. One survivor, a young woman, was found later. She was alive. But she wasn't in New Richmond anymore. She was found in a field, miles away. She had been carried through the air by the storm. She was still clutching her purse. Let's try to imagine the sound again. Survivors said it wasn't just a roar, it was a shrieking, the sound of nails being pulled out of wood, the sound of glass shattering, the sound of timber snapping. It was a cacophony of destruction. The air was filled with missiles. That is the technical term. A 2x4 piece of lumber, flying at 150 miles per hour, is a missile. It will go through a brick wall. It will go through a car. In 1899, the streets were lined with wagons and buggies. The tornado picked them up and threw them through storefronts. Horses were lifted into the air. An iron safe, weighing 3,000 pounds, was ripped from a store and thrown a massive distance. 3,000 pounds. Just think about the force required to do that. It's hard to comprehend. Main Street, the pride of New Richmond, was being fed into a grinder. The opera house, the knick-knack shops, the hotels, the Glover family, the wealthy family we mentioned earlier, their money couldn't stop the wind. Their status couldn't shield them. They were in the thick of it, just like the farmers, just like the drifters. The tornado is the great equalizer, and then, as quickly as it had arrived, it was gone. The roar faded to the northeast, the wind dropped, the rain stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Absolute, heavy silence. It was 6:15 p.m. The whole event, the destruction of an entire town, had taken less than 10 minutes. 5 minutes of actual impact. In 5 minutes, 300 buildings were gone. In 5 minutes, the landscape had been changed so drastically that survivors crawling out of the rubble didn't know where they were. They couldn't recognize their own street. Where is the drugstore? Where is the hotel? Where is my house? Gone. All of it. But the silence was a lie. Because the tragedy of New Richmond wasn't over. The storm had passed. Yes. But remember those cook stoves? Remember that it was dinner time? Hundreds of wood-burning stoves had been lit to cook the evening meal. When the houses were smashed, those stoves were overturned. Burning wood, hot coals, were spilled out into the wreckage. The wreckage was made of dry timber, splintered wood, lath, and shingles. It was a giant pile of kindling, and deep inside the rubble, where the trapped survivors were screaming for help, little fires began to spark. The wind had stopped, but the fire was just beginning. Smoke. That was the first smell, not the smell of wet earth or pine, which you would expect after a storm, but the smell of burning wood, burning varnish, burning cloth. The silence that had fallen over New Richmond lasted only a few heartbeats. Then, the screaming started again, but this time, the terror wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from the ground. You have to understand the layout of the debris field. Main Street was gone. In its place was a tangled mountain of wood, brick, and glass, piled 10 to 15 feet high in some places. Buried inside that mountain were hundreds of people. Some were dead, but many were alive, trapped in air pockets, pinned under beams, waiting for rescue. But, as we mentioned, the dinner stoves had been lit. Thousands of hot coals were now scattered throughout that dry, splintered wood. It started as a small flicker near the rubble of the Methodist church, then another flicker near the drugstore. The wind had died down, but there was enough of a breeze to fan the flames, and suddenly, the pile caught fire. Imagine the horror of that moment. You have just survived an F5 tornado. You are trapped in the dark, pinned by a beam, unable to move. You are thanking God that you are alive. And then, you feel the heat. You see the orange glow growing brighter through the cracks in the wood above you. You smell the smoke. Panic. Absolute, primal panic. The survivors on the surface realized what was happening immediately. They saw the smoke rising. They rushed to the pile. They clawed at the wood with their bare hands. Get water! Get the fire wagon! But here is the next cruel twist of the knife. The tornado had destroyed the waterworks. It had smashed the water tower. It had severed the mains. There was no water pressure. The fire hoses were useless. The people of New Richmond stood there, helpless, watching their town turn into a funeral pyre. They tried to form bucket brigades, running to the river and back, but the river was choked with debris, and a bucket of water against a raging inferno is like trying to put out a volcano with a teacup. The fire spread rapidly. It moved from the church rubble to the store rubble to the bank rubble. It threatened to consume everything the wind had left behind. But then, a miracle. Or perhaps just a mercy. The sky opened up again. A torrential rain began to fall, a deluge. It was heavy enough to hiss against the flames. It was heavy enough to soak the wood and slow the spread of the fire. It didn't put the fires out completely, but it dampened them. It bought the rescuers time, but with the rain came the cold. The temperature plummeted, so now the survivors were wet, in shock, bleeding, and freezing, and darkness was falling. Night falls early when the sky is black with storm clouds. By 7:30 p.m., it was pitch dark, and New Richmond was an island. The telegraph poles were snapped. The telephone lines were a tangled mess of wire on the ground. The railroad tracks were blocked by trees and overturned houses. Nobody outside of New Richmond knew what had happened. The world was going on as normal. Minneapolis didn't know. St. Paul didn't know. Even the neighboring towns just thought it was a bad thunderstorm. They had no idea that 3,000 people were currently living through hell, just a few miles away. They needed help. They needed doctors. They needed trains. But they couldn't call for them. Someone had to go. This is the moment for heroes. We don't know all their names, but we know that men, despite their injuries, despite the shock, realized what had to be done. They set out on afoot. They set out on horses that had survived the storm. They had to navigate roads that were non-existent, climbing over fallen oaks, wading through mud, dodging down power lines. They headed for the nearest telegraph station that was still standing, the town of Roberts, or Boardman. Imagine that run, running through the dark, with the screams of your dying neighbors fading behind you, knowing that every minute you waste, lives are being lost. Finally, the message went out. The telegraph operator in the next town tapped out the code. New Richmond destroyed. Send help. Send doctors. Send everything. The message hit St. Paul like a bombshell. Back in the ruins. The darkness was absolute. They had no streetlights, no electricity. How do you search for survivors in a pitch-black mountain of sharp debris? This is where the circus comes back into the story. The Gollmar Brothers Circus, the intruder that had kept everyone in town, now became the savior. The circus workers, the roustabouts, the performers. They didn't flee. They opened their supply wagons. They pulled out their lanterns, the big, heavy, kerosene lanterns they used to light the big top. They lit them up, scores of them, and they waded into the wreckage. Imagine that visual, a destroyed town, black and rain-swept, and moving through the darkness, the ghostly lights of the circus. Strong men, who made their living lifting heavy tent poles, were now lifting heavy beams off of trapped women and children. The clowns, the acrobats, the ticket takers. They worked side by side with the lumberjacks and the bankers. The circus tent itself, the one that had miraculously survived, was converted. It wasn't a place of joy anymore. It became a field hospital. They carried the wounded there. They laid them on the canvas. The show must go on. But this was a different kind of show. This was a fight for life. But human nature is complex. In every disaster, there is heroism, and there is darkness. Rumors began to spread in the night, rumors of looters, people coming in from the shadows to strip jewelry off the bodies of the dead, to crack open the cash registers lying in the street. Whether these rumors were widespread or exaggerated, the fear was real. Men formed vigilante groups. They patrolled the perimeter of the ruin with shotguns. "Halt! Who goes there?" The atmosphere was tense, paranoia mixed with grief. Every shadow looked like a thief. Every sound sounded like a threat. The chaos of the natural world had passed, but the chaos of the human world was just starting. Midnight. The rain is still falling. The doctors in the makeshift hospital are running out of bandages. They are running out of morphine. Despair is setting in. And then, a sound, a whistle, far off in the distance, piercing the night, the train whistle. It was the most beautiful sound those people had ever heard. The first relief train from St. Paul was breaking through. It was loaded with doctors, nurses, police, and supplies. It had to move slowly, clearing debris from the tracks as it came. But it was coming. When the headlight of that locomotive cut through the darkness, illuminating the shattered remains of the depot, grown men wept. Help had arrived. The emergency train is a forgotten hero of American history. In the days before helicopters, these trains were the only lifeline. They turned the passenger cars into ambulances. They loaded the critically injured, the ones with crushed limbs, the ones with severe burns, and they raced them back to the hospitals in the Twin Cities, back and forth, all night long. The sun rose on June 13th at 5:20 a.m. The storm clouds were gone. The sky was a brilliant, innocent blue, and under that cruel sun, the true scale of the horror was revealed. When the light hit New Richmond, the survivors stopped working. They just stared. The town looked like a war zone. Actually, it looked worse than a war zone. In war, buildings are usually left standing, just damaged. Here, entire blocks had been rubbed out. The trees were stripped bare, looking like white skeletons pointing at the sky. Dead animals littered the streets. And the bodies. We have to talk about the bodies. The wind had done terrible things. It had stripped people of their clothing. The mud, the dark, black mud from the river bottom, was plastered over everything. It covered the faces of the dead. Survivors walked through the streets, looking for their loved ones, but they couldn't recognize them. They had to wipe the mud from the faces of the bodies lying in the rows, just to see if it was their wife, their son, their brother. It was a grim procession, 117 dead. That was the final count. But on that morning, nobody knew the number. They just knew that everyone was missing someone. Do you remember the safe? The 3,000-pound iron safe we told you about? The one from the bank? They found it that morning. It was a block away from where the bank used to be. It was battered, dent-eyed, scratched, but it was locked. When they finally pried it open, the papers inside were undisturbed. Cash, deeds, titles. The wind could move the mountain, but it couldn't break the lock. It became a symbol, a small victory in a sea of defeat. But there were other safes that didn't hold. Basements, which people thought were safe havens, had become traps. When the houses above them caught fire or collapsed, the basements became graves. The lesson learned that day changed the way people in the Midwest thought about safety. It wasn't enough to be underground. You had to have a way out. 117 lives. It sounds like a statistic, but let's break it down. Whatever demographic you can think of, the storm took them. The wealthy Glovers, who sat in the best seats, they died. The farmhands who couldn't afford a ticket, they died. There were entire families wiped out. The Jones family, the Smith family, all gone in seconds. 26 of the dead were children under the age of 10. Think about that. An entire classroom of children, gone. And the injuries. Over 600 people were seriously hurt. In a town of 3,000, that means almost everyone was either bleeding or burying someone who was. There was no PTSD diagnosis in 1899. They called it Cyclone Sickness. People who survived would, for years afterwards, freeze whenever the sky turned dark. They would hide in their cellars at the first rumble of thunder. The psychological scar was deeper than the physical one. But this story doesn't end with death. It ends with grit, because New Richmond didn't die. On June 14th, 2 days after the storm, while the smoke was still rising, a sign appeared on a pile of bricks on Main Street. A shopkeeper had found a piece of wood and some paint. He wrote, "We are still here, open for business as soon as I find the door." It was a joke, a dark joke, but it was defiance. The lumber industry rallied, the farmers rallied, donations poured in from all over the country. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Chicago. They cleared the rubble, they burned the wreckage, and they started to build. They built back better. They built with more brick. They built with more steel. The Methodist Church was rebuilt. The bank was rebuilt. Within a year, if you walk down Main Street, you might not even know that the finger of God had touched this place. Except for the gaps in the trees. Today, if you visit New Richmond, you can see the legacy. There is a monument, simple, solemn. It lists the names of the 117. But the real monument is the town itself. Every house standing today is a testament to the people who refused to leave. But there is a haunting question that lingers. The what if? What if the Gollmar Brothers Circus hadn't come to town that day? What if the parade had been canceled? What if the thousands of tourists had stayed home? History is full of these coincidences, these perfect storms where fate seems to conspire against us. The joy of the circus brought them there. The violence of the sky kept them there. It reminds us that life is fragile, that the line between a day of celebration and a day of mourning is razor thin. It reminds us that we are small, and the sky is big. We have radar now. We have sirens. We have apps on our phones. But when the sky turns green, when the birds stop singing, and when that low rumble starts, the fear is exactly the same as it was in 1899. We are still just people, standing in the dark, hoping the storm passes us by. Thank you for watching this story. It's a heavy one, I know, but it's important to remember these events, to remember the names. If you found value in this documentary, please hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that history matters. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your invitation. Join us. We have many more stories to tell, from the depths of the ocean to the edge of space. And a special thank you to our channel members. You are the producers of this show. You make this possible. If you want to see your name in the credits and get early access to our videos, click the join button down below. Stay safe out there. Keep an eye on the sky, and I'll see you in the next one.